This is Horsepower Heritage. Maurice Merrick here. Welcome back. Well, if you're a regular listener, then you'll know I'm a big fan of Italian cars. And this time we're diving into the astonishing history of the Italian motor industry with one of my all-time favorite guests. Author Peter Grimsdale returns to the podcast to talk about his new book, Superveloce, How Italian Cars Conquered the World. Peter was on the show previously to discuss his book, Racing in the Dark, How the Bentley Boys Conquered Le Mans. That was way back in April 2023, so scroll back in the catalog. It's definitely worth a listen if you haven't heard it. And now Peter has taken on the story of Italy's car makers with a fascinating cast of characters and wonderful details throughout. It's a fantastic read. Superveloce is available on Amazon.com. There's a link in the show notes. So order your copy. I promise you won't be disappointed. And now here's my conversation with Peter Grimsdale. Enjoy. Peter, I'm so excited to be with you again.
Well, I'm thrilled to be back.
By the way, we're on the cusp of the Christmas season, and people are, of course, already shopping. So I want to tell my listeners, you have to get this book. For someone you love or just for yourself, it's wonderful. Peter, for such a powerhouse of automotive achievement, Italy was a bit late to the party, weren't they?
It's astonishing. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I started researching it. I mean, if you will imagine, Italy had no industrial revolution like France or Britain or Germany, or even for that matter, the USA in the 19th century. Not only that, it had only just become a country, and it had very little coal, very little iron ore. You may know that 50% of the population were illiterate.
Yes.
And yet, by 1907, they were winning all the major Grand Prix. How could they have done this?
Right. Unification came in, I think, 1861. And prior to that, it was a bunch of city-states, rivals. You know, they were going to war against each other very often.
Yeah. And right after that, there was a long agricultural depression because grain from Ukraine and from the US started to come into Europe. And Italy's agrarian system, which was already pretty medieval, was just completely shot to pieces.
I think you say in the book, and I don't remember the exact time period, but something like 14 million Italians left because it was so bad. You know, that's why we had this mass Italian immigration in the late 19th century.
Yeah.
So they missed the industrial age, but they managed to show up for the machine age, which was right in the offing.
Yeah, this is what's so interesting because, you know, I attempted to answer the question, you know, how come they managed to do this without an industrial revolution? But, you know, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that while there wasn't a heavy industrial revolution, you know, like big railway kind of building and stuff like that, there were small metalworking places like Ferrari's father. There were lots and lots of small metalworking operations all over, particularly northern Italy. And not only that, there was a heritage that goes right back to the Renaissance era of armor building. So as well as building munitions, it was also creating body armor. And in fact, when Henry VIII wanted to set up the armory at Greenwich in London, he brought all these guys from Milan, show them how to do it. So lurking beneath this was an incredible craft culture. And if you look at how the Italian industry evolved, with the honorable exception of Fiat, it's all about that culture.
In the book, you sort of trace the history and tradition of armor making to...
Yes, I touched on it, yeah.
Right. And you take that and you sort of draw a parallel to the panel beaters of the 20th century, the carrozzerie.
Well, obviously part of this story, as well as them being incredible engineers, they're also fantastic body makers, the carrozzerie. And what's extraordinary about it is how so much of it was done just with a hammer and a tree stump.
Right.
You know, that and creating the most wonderful, what we call compound curves, you know, like a contact lens, something that curves both ways, which of course is That's what a breastplate is, in body armor.
Sure.
You need a compound curve. They were completely adept at that. It was as if it was hardwired into their DNA. And so that's a whole other side of it as well.
And there's a little vignette you have in the book about the test that was given to young men who wanted to work as carrozzeria. And the test was take 2 pieces of sheet metal and make 2 perfect hemispheres so that they'll fit together. And here's your hammer and here's your tree stump. Go at it.
Yeah. And if you did it, you got the job, apparently.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
You've written, of course, about the British motor industry, Bentley, Jaguar. What was the impetus for this book?
It happened almost by accident. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a pediatrician, and he was telling me the story of when he was a young doctor. He decided he really wanted an Alfa Romeo, and I guess he didn't buy quite the right one because it was always breaking down. And he told me a wonderful story about how he was planning to propose to his wife, and he was going to stop on London Bridge, in the middle of London Bridge, and turn to her and propose. And so he pulled over and she just said, "Oh, no, not again." She just assumed that the car had broken down. Anyway, when he finished that anecdote, he said, "Why don't you do High Performance was the first book I wrote, which was about British cars just after the war. Why don't you do an Italian version of High Performance?" And I think, no, that's a good idea. And I woke up the following day and I thought, yeah, maybe I should just look into that. And I just kind of had a cursory look. And then by the end of the day, I thought, this is a really good idea. And I was actually proposing to write a sequel to High Performance, which was taking the British story through the 80s and 90s. But I wrote a couple of pages on the Italian idea, and they just said, "We want that." I was very, very lucky to get it commissioned like that. It was just like a no-brainer for them. Although what I had originally just planned to do was start immediately after the Second World War, because, in fact, at the front of the book is the story of the British Grand Prix of 1950, the first Formula One race. And this was a big moment for the Brits because, we just won the war and we got the first Formula One race ever, and it was going to be the British Grand Prix. And the royal family came to watch. It's the only time a king and queen have ever come to a motor race in Britain. And they stood there and watched the Italians go past. The red cars come first, second, third. Where were the Brits? Hang on. Didn't we just win a war? Yeah. How do they do this? And that was the kind of inciting incident for me to kind of say, well, it's all like it happened this way. But the more I got into it, the more I really felt like I had to go right back to the beginning. I had to go back to the 1890s to just discover how the hell it happened. So I ended up writing it wasn't a longer book. It was a bit longer, but bigger, a wider canvas. And I'm very pleased to have done that because the early days sometimes it's kind of hard to write about the early days of motoring, but actually this was a real thrill. It was a real thrill.
Well, the cast of characters that the book begins with, they're there virtually the entire story. I mean, nearly the whole 20th century. So that's very interesting. And they're all so interconnected, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise because that's what happens in industry. Whatever the industry is, the same people sort of, become this melange for the industry.
Very true.
For those who haven't heard my previous conversation with you, I should say that you were a writer of fiction novels, and then this is your third foray into a nonfiction venue?
Yeah, yes, it is. Yes, going back a bit further, I spent most of my I was in television for a lot of my life and making nonfiction programs, nonfiction output. A lot of it was history. A lot of it was social history. So I'd spend a lot of time interviewing people, making films about modern history. So I was kind of familiar with that territory. But it kind of happened by accident because I had been writing thrillers and still do somewhat. But one of my best friends, like childhood friends, and we were like car enthusiasts together. He said, "When are you going to write a book about cars?" And I thought, I don't know, maybe I should just have a go. Maybe I'll see what happens. And I was very interested. The kernel of it, what really got me going, was I knew about the sort of sports car craze in America just after the war, how America just fell in love with British sports cars in a way that the Brits did not expect them to at all. It was a complete accident. And a lot of it was thanks to Shell Cavalli, who spotted the MGTC and looked at it and thought he was looking for motorbikes to sell in his showroom in Almeida, and he thought, well, this is like a 4-wheel motorbike.
Yes,
This is a more commodious version, and he just fell in love with it because, the one thing that the MG suited very fine was Californian weather.
absolutely. Well, the reason I wanted to sort of give a little bit of background is because your story in Superveloce, like your other books, is very much character driven. You're interested in characters. And of course, there's no way we could cover the entire book in this conversation, and we wouldn't want to. But what I thought we could do is talk about some of these characters and give people a little bit of background, and that'll inform the larger story. And I think we should start with Giovanni Agnelli. Born in 1866, a former cavalry officer. His family had some means, but they weren't nobles. He had to work. But he was an organizational genius. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew how to put logistics together and organize people and processes. And it was some of this came from his military background, of course, but I think it was also sort of innate in him.
Yes, I think, nobody's actually drawn that conclusion. I drew that conclusion because I know quite a lot about what happens to people at military school. And I also know from all my other work that logistics is so important in warfare. I made a film about railways and warfare years ago for the BBC and A&E, and looking at how railways influenced the American Civil War profoundly, and just recognizing all that, because with what Agnelli seemed to realize right from the start was that he was building an industry. He wasn't building a car. He was around which you might have some workshops to make more room to build more cars. He saw the whole thing from the start as an industry, very visionary, and a lot like Henry Ford in a way. And indeed, one of his first trips outside, he went to, first of all, he went to Paris and he saw what was happening because, in the 1890s, France was the world center of the automobile. The Germans had invented it, but it was the French who commercialized it. But he saw what was happening in the workshops in Paris, and he saw, there were 200 guys at lathes, and he realized if you want to make double your production, you've got to get another 200 guys and another 200 lathes. How's that going to work? And then he went to America, actually before Henry Ford had properly got into mass production. But the key thing that he learned from Henry Ford was how much Ford invested in tooling. He got the message that the more sophisticated the tools, the less you lent on skilled work, that you didn't need skilled fitters to fit everything together, that you could make pieces of car that snap together like Lego.
Right. And so Agnelli saw the scalability of the industry in a way that he hadn't seen it before.
Yeah. But the critical difference because he could never do what Henry Ford did, and like make one car, because there just simply there wasn't the customer base. In Italy, you had to kind of duck and dive and, you make a few of this and some of that and a bit of this and a bit of that, because you never know what's quite going to work and how many people are going to be up. They didn't have this, Henry Ford benefited massively from this huge emerging class of people who had enough money to buy a car. And that wasn't true at all in Europe. for a long time, and it certainly wasn't true in Italy. So he did start off making kind of high-end cars, like everybody else, and then gradually kind of worked down and down and down, and wanted to just like progressively get smaller, cheaper, more affordable, which he was pretty much getting to by the time of the First World War.
Right. And so Agnelli leaves the cavalry and eventually winds up as a secretary at Fiat, which Fiat is an acronym, Fabbrica Industriale Automobili Torino. And Turin becomes the center of the Italian motor industry.
Turin and Milan, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so Fiat is building, as you say, these big, powerful, luxurious cars, which we don't, unless you're a student of automotive history, that doesn't occur to you, because we've always known Fiat in the modern day as a builder of economy cars, everyday cars.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, like you say, he sees the need to go to more affordable offerings. But in the meantime, he gets really interested in going racing.
Yes.
And the early Fiats are these massive, powerful racers.
It was a crazy time, because for the first, it's only the first decade of the 20th century where everybody was going, in order to go faster, we've just got to build a bigger car. And so you end up with 16, 22-liter cars. And they were monsters. And he recognized that in order to make a name for Italian cars, he had to get involved in racing. It was the best possible form of marketing. But it was scary, because it kind of depended on you winning. You'd get sort of noticed if you got in the first couple or third, but and we're talking about racing, across there were barely roads, there were no racetracks as such. So these cars had to be incredibly durable. And when you kind of try and compare a 1906-07 Fiat sports car with an equivalent Benz or Mercedes, I mean, it's not that obvious what makes them better, but I think there's a kind of inherent, Italian cars over the years, on the bad day, have developed a reputation for unreliability. But my God, back then, reliability was absolutely everything. Because really, if you could finish, you could quite often finish first, because the people had to stop on the way, to repair something or change something. They weren't necessarily going to get first. So just durability was key, and it worked really, really well, because Fiat opened a showroom in New York in something like 1903-04. A Lancia, who had started out as a driver for Fiat, and went on his own in 1908. Again, starting exporting cars to the States. He had a showroom too, and traded on his reputation as a racing driver, because he had shone in international races.
Yes.
Important point was export was an absolute priority for them, because there just wasn't the market. And this is what makes them a bit different from everybody else, because the Germans and the Italians, and certainly the Germans and the French, and certainly the Brits, we had a home market to lean on. The Italians had to export; they absolutely had to.
And we'll get into Vincenzo Lancia. Another amazing figure that was there from the early days was Battista Farina. And of course, everyone knows Pininfarina as the coach builder to Ferrari, the de facto coach builder to Ferrari. And Farina was born in 1893, so he's quite a bit younger than Agnelli. His family left their village that was just outside of Turin. They left to go to the city because they needed to work. They needed to survive. And his brother got an apprenticeship at a coach builder. So Farina, as a young boy, was visiting his brother at work and looking through the gates and seeing the men work.
Yeah, he was kind of car mad from the sight of his first car. He wrote the most wonderful memoir, which is translated and may be available in the US. I commend it to anybody interested in this subject, because I think quite late in life, I think he sat down with a friend and a tape recorder and just told his story. He had amazing, amazing recollection. And he talks about seeing Turin as a child and seeing the first automobiles darting in and out of between the carriages. And he very quickly becomes kind of frustrated that these wonderful machines, they look kind of ungainly because they just look like carriages. They look like literally horseless carriages, but they haven't developed their own design language. And but he's obsessed with the idea of what that could and should be. And by the time his brother sets up a garage, little workshop on his own, so Pinin goes and works for his brother, and very soon they're doing stuff for Fiat. And Agnelli, I think, takes a bit of a shine to him because he's still a teenager when he designs the Fiat Zero.
Yes, in 1912.
And this is one of the other very special things that's quite surprising and interesting about Italy, is that he's not the only one who is completely self-taught, showed a bit of aptitude, and people say, okay, you can come and do this. The gates opened. If you showed willing and aptitude, fine, doesn't matter. There are other guys there who had fantastic degrees in engineering, and actually that's another big piece of why things work so well in Italy, is that in Milan and in Turin and Genoa and various other places, there were some very, very good technical universities. And what's so extraordinary about them, they were very willing to embrace the future. So whereas a lot of, Bentley and Royce, they'd come up through railway locomotive yards, they'd done their apprenticeships in heavy railway engineering. These guys, they completely bypassed all that.
Yes. Well, and that brings up an interesting social aspect to the times, which is that childhood was relatively short as compared to today. I mean, I think we've sort of extended childhood unnecessarily, but a lot of these guys got their start very young. And by the way, I should also mention Pinin was his nickname. It's Piemontese for essentially shorty. I don't think he ever...
The littlest.
Yes, the littlest. I don't think he ever got any taller than about 5 feet his entire life. He was a small man. But and then later, of course, the name Pininfarina becomes the family name. They actually change it from Farina to Pininfarina.
Yes, because he worked for his brother Farina, and that company was that carrozzeria was called Stabilimenti Farina, and then he went on his own in the 30s, and of course just called his company Pininfarina, and eventually turned his family surname into Pininfarina, one word.
Yeah.
But that didn't actually happen until a bit later.
It is amazing to think about how he had a vision for a much, let's say, simpler and more streamlined car design, even from the very early days. And one of the things he said was that this is a quote you have in the book, I had learned from my work that what you take off counts more than what you add on. In fact, as we know, there are superfluous things everywhere. To his eye, the coach building in the 1920s, let's say, was just overwrought. And his whole early life was like struggling to break away from the convention of the wagon design, which it took the automobile a good 30 years to break away from.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, they were very dependent on the craft of coach building, literally building coaches, and that was all about wooden frames. And of course, again, America makes the leap towards pressed steel pretty early. But the thing about pressed steel is it only works if you only pay for those massive presses that you're going to need if you make 100,000 of the same thing. And that was not going to work for the Italian motor industry because they had to make a whole variety of stuff. So how do you create those great compound curves in numbers, and how do you make them work on a motor car? Because there's only so much shaping of wood you can do, and if you have a heavy wooden frame underneath your lovely curves, then you're going to end up with a very heavy car, not to mention, is quite squeaky because it's very hard to eliminate squeakiness from wood frames. So what you then get is the development of what's called superleggera, which is basically the simplest way of describing it is a bit like a bird cage. You make a frame of wire, of thin metal tube, and you make it exactly how the shape of the car is going to be, and then you cover that with shaped metal, and that liberated everybody to make much more organic shaped shaped bodies.
Right. And that was an innovation that came from a carrozzeria called Touring.
Yes. Very curiously, there's a weird English side to this story, which was that I'm just going to jump back a bit and tell you about the first Fiat car. Was actually built by two brothers called Cirano, who went on to found Itala, and they were all over the early days of the Italian industry. When they made their first car, they'd been selling British bicycles, Rudge Whitworth bicycles. And I'm sure some of your more informed listeners will know that Rudge Whitworth also pretty much invented the wire wheel. But anyway, they'd been selling Rudge Whitworth, and you can't imagine a more British sounding name than that. And they thought, our car should have a name that's a bit like that. And they took the two words well and yes, because they'd heard people say, well, yes, I think so. And they took these two words, well and yes, and they put an E in the middle for it, for and. And so the first car they made was called the Wellias.
Yes.
Anyway, so this is a bit of a sidebar, but when Andolini wanted to set up on his own and create his own carrozzeria, he decided to use a nice English word, touring. And that's why you get this most wonderful Italian body cars with a kind of word that sounds very, very familiar.
No, that's a good story. And the Cirano brothers, eventually they separate from Fiat, and Giovanni Agnelli was very clever and very enterprising. And at a certain point, he's the controlling shareholder of Fiat. Oh,
yes. I mean, Agnelli is an extraordinary man. And, people are very familiar with the whole dynasty. And particularly Gianni, his grandson. But you've got to hand it to him. He was very, very financially astute. And what you also got to remember is that he had this. The original founders of Fiat were a bunch of aristocrats who were basically enthusiasts of motor car. They had lots of money, and they had a vague idea of a sort of philanthropic exercise of starting a factory and employing lots of people, and well-intentioned. And then you had a couple of technical guys who were the Cirano brothers, who had actually built the car. They basically that car with the extraordinary name became the first Fiat, and they used that, and they just basically put that into production. But Agnelli was it was a bit like herding cats in a way, because he had all these aristocrats, and he said, "Look, if we're going to do this, if I'm going to be involved in this, we're going to do it my way." And he pretty much took over because somebody needed to. Because nobody quite in Italy had run anything like this before. I mean, there were companies that grew up that were fantastically well run, like Olivetti and Pirelli, and there were lots of others around. But this was pretty new stuff, and he took a very firm grip on it, and he pretty much became the controlling shareholder.
Hey guys, I want to take a quick break to say if you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, there are a few ways you can support the show. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and become a patron. There's a link in the show notes. You can make a one-time donation, or you can support the show monthly. It's easy, and for the price of a latte, you can help me continue to bring you more of the people and stories behind the machines. You can also leave 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because that helps new listeners discover the show. Thanks for your support, and now back to the show. All right, another giant in the early days was Vincenzo Lancia, who we've mentioned, but and he was born in 1881. So he's between Agnelli and Battista in age. And he founded Lancia in 1906 while he was still working at Fiat.
Yes, yes, extraordinary. He just to back up a little bit. His father had done very well in the food canning business. He was a pioneer of food canning and made quite a lot of money out of that. And wanted Vincenzo to go into the business. And Vincenzo was very good. He was very good at maths, but he was not interested in studying. He was always in trouble. But they had a country house and they had a townhouse. And the townhouse, they'd let the downstairs rooms to the Cirano brothers. So Vincenzo was growing up with these guys down below making bicycles and motorcycles and then motor cars. He was completely fascinated by them. And he persuaded his father to let him do a sort of apprentice bookkeeping for the Ciranos. I'm not sure how much bookkeeping went on because very rapidly it became clear that Vincenzo was amazing, had amazing natural mechanical aptitude. And they said he could listen to an engine and say, I know exactly what's wrong. It's the third, tap it there, whatever. He just had that amazing sixth sense. But he was also a really good driver. And so when Agnelli basically co-opted the Cirano brothers' car and brought the Ciranos into the Fiat business, he also brought whoever else was on the shop floor, and that included Vincenzo. And he put him in charge of quality control and test driving because at that stage, every car you made had to be thoroughly tested to make sure all the bits worked before it went anywhere near a customer. And that was his job. And then when they got into racing, he raced the cars. So he was really he was an extraordinary guy. He was larger than life, fantastically clever, very musical, a Renaissance man, really. And what is also interesting is, when the Ciranos decide to leave Fiat and go on their own, say, okay, fine, good luck, bye. Let us know if we can help you out. And it was the same with Lancia. Is it if Agnelli said, of course you would want to go and set up on your own. That's the obvious thing to do. We'll keep you on as a racing driver so you can, earn some money with us. A very sort of helpful the paternalism, which is really, really special and unusual to it, is very, very powerful all the way through the story.
Absolutely. It's so many examples of that. And by the way, you mentioned he could detect faults in a car just by listening. I can't remember who the quote is attributed to in the book, but someone had remarked, Lancia has the ears of a blind man. I mean, just highly tuned. Yeah, very good. And so his contribution to the industry is really a lot of innovation. He built his cars differently. He sort of eschewed the conventional engineering and design. And so some of the examples that are most prominent are the first unibody car, the Lambda, in 1922. And the Lambda also had a very interesting coil-sprung suspension that had two interconnected tubes with a spring in the middle. It was an independent suspension setup, unlike the traditional leaf-sprung suspension that most cars had. It also had an overhead cam V4 engine, which is incredible, very compact. And unlike anything else at the time, which most engines were just monsters, they were huge because that's what you did, right? If you wanted more power, you added more cc's.
It was beginning to change in the 20s, I think, when people were realizing that what the secret was actually trying to make the cars lighter and extracting more power, making the engines more sophisticated, more valves, and then obviously supercharging. I mean, they pretty much pioneers, and not Lancia particularly, but supercharging became very, very important very early on in the 20s. But yeah, Lancia, it was almost Lancia is a bit like there are one or two other people around in European story who just like embrace, like, what's new? Hey, let's try this thing. Let's make this thing work. And because he was his Lancia was a lovely family business. He was the boss. He had his engineers. They were all very close to him. He treated everybody like they were his sons. And they were like, let's see if we can do something really different together. And he was very encouraging people to experiment.
He also recognized the importance of lightening the car. He found ways to make the sheet metal thinner and yet, retain the rigidity and the strength And he told coach builders, hey, we have found through our experience that, lightness is very important. So bear this in mind when you're building bodies for our cars.
Please don't weigh down my car with your terrible old bodywork. Yes.
In a way, he's sort of like shades of Colin Chapman, obsessed with the lightness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Because when he was exporting, when they export, that everything was exported as much as possible was exported, and the Lancias were coming to America in numbers early on, and so the instructions, because they were just chassis when they arrived, the bodies were all fitted locally. If you exported to England or America, whatever, that's where the bodies would be added. So I was like, please don't weigh the car down. Please do it this way if possible. He was a natural control freak and just longed to be able to kind of dictate that. Of course, as he was able to later on as time went on.
All right. Well, so we've covered a little bit of Fiat and Lancia, but another legendary brand in Italy, of course, is Alfa Romeo. And it was founded as Alfa, another acronym, Anonima Lombarda Fabbrica Automobili. So in Lombard, in Milan. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. It was actually the factory was built by the Frenchman Darracq.
That's
who
right.
wanted to expand. I mean, Darracq was one of those companies that was briefly incredibly successful and then vanished almost as quickly. And Darracq wanted to branch out. He thought, I'll build a factory in Italy. We can build my voiturette in Italy and sell those more there. But the problem with the Darracq was it just completely unsuitable for Italian. It just wasn't durable enough. The French were brilliant at roads. They got lovely smooth roads in their towns and around their cities. Not so in Italy. Just didn't work at all. And he basically thought, well, I'm out of here. And just basically, but along the way had built the what became the great Alfa Works. And he just kind of handed it to the banks and left. And the bankers went, well, we should go on building cars if we can. So they hired an engineer called Maurice and got themselves into business, making a decent, durable. Maurice built a decent, durable, quite successful car, but profit eluded them somewhat, and they were in quite dire straits already when World War I happened. And suddenly everybody needed a lot of trucks, needed a lot of guns, and along came Nicola Romeo. Nicola Romeo is quite different in as much as he'd come from the South. He'd come from the impoverished South. His father was a poor. He was a teacher, but he was very, very poor. And Nicola got himself through college by tutoring other kids. He was brilliant, and he actually arrived in Milan with 3 degrees, one of which he'd acquired in Germany. I'm told about the prejudice against the Southerners, and it may have been the case that people were just like, who's this Southerner? Excitable Southerner, I don't want to work with him. And he was all set to actually just go and work on the railways when some British civil engineer guys came along and asked him to be their agent in Milan. And so he did this, and then he thought, was this building mining equipment and is great stuff. So he very rapidly went into it and became very successful, and basically took on Alfa as another part of his expanding empire, which is how you get Alfa Romeo. And then carried on after the end of the First World War, eventually went back to building cars and back to not making any money, which is the story of Alfa Romeo all through its life, pretty much. Making fantastic machines, but not making very much money.
Right. They did very well with wartime contracts. But of course, the spigot was turned off immediately at the armistice.
Yeah. And it was very rough in Italy after the First World War. There's massive unemployment, very near revolution.
And of course, the rise of Benito Mussolini, which is a very interesting thread through the first half of the book, because Mussolini was a car enthusiast and he loved Alfa Romeos. He had his own Alfa Romeo Sport Touring Coupe. And because Alfa was his favorite, there was a certain point where Alfa was sort of on the ropes financially. And rather than going into receivership or liquidation, it was sort of suggested that they not do that. because you don't want to displease Il Duce.
Well, what happened was, all through the 20s, when they were developing those fantastic, 1750 and those wonderful cars, they were in serious financial trouble. And this was a kind of a legacy because Romeo had accumulated this great combine. It just got completely overextended, and they had to keep selling bits off to try and keep going. And it was a basket case, and people would get hired to come and run it, and they would leave with their heads in their hands. And it was just like the last guy came in and said, "We should just close it down." And Agnelli was watching on the sidelines. He said, "Oh, I'll take over the factory. Yeah, I could use something. I could expand. I could build some trucks there." And it's Mussolini who steps in and said, "No, no, 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 no. We're going to nationalize it. Well, bring it under." He created this organization known as the IRA. I've forgotten what it stands for, but it's something like Industrial Reconstruction, and is equivalent to nationalizing, which of course we did a lot of in Europe. And so it became a nationalized business, so it was safe. And in fact, what they did do was that coincided quite neatly with rearmament. So Alfa Romeo, like everybody else, got a lot of contracts for army equipment, and indeed got into the whole business of making aero engines as well.
Yeah. One other thing I want to say about Mussolini and actually the rise of fascism in both Italy and in Germany, industry had a choice to make. Do they resist this new authoritarianism, or do they survive? I mean, really, it comes down to that.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm not sure I'm not sure they really sat and thought about it too much, because basically to offer any kind of resistance in the early days, that would have just been terminal.
Right.
What is interesting, what happened fascism in Italy is way different from Germany. And indeed, Mussolini and Agnelli kind of agreed not to kind of fight. Turin was never a fascist city. The Turinese just remained really skeptical about Mussolini all the way through, and Agnelli was a big operation. And I think Mussolini was quite a pragmatist, and he just thought, I'll just let them get on with what they do. The fascist trade unions never got anywhere in Fiat companies, and they just kind of like kept out of each other's way, really. But certainly, let's say the industry benefited, from having it basically because of the rearmament angle, really. I think that was the main thing. And also that part of the whole fascist ideology, which is not that similar from other countries, was just like we must build our way out of, we must build our way out of recession. So
right.
So on they went. One little side thing about Mussolini's contribution was when you obviously are familiar with the Mille Miglia, the amazing 1,000-mile motor race around Italy. Of course, it probably couldn't have happened or couldn't have started in a country that didn't have some kind of quite authoritarian rule, because in order to make that race happen, you had to have the government say, yeah, sure, you can close 1,000 miles of roads, and here is the army to police it for you, which Mussolini did.
Right. 25,000 soldiers along the route. I think they were spaced out like 10 a mile or 5 a mile or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, I can't do the math, but yes.
I guess I just wanted to mention that sort of those political wins, because it's a very complex environment. And as you say, Agnelli navigates it kind of with a light touch. He doesn't resist. They sort of keep each other at arm's length, Mussolini and Agnelli. And Mussolini also knows how powerful and influential Agnelli is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they just kept, and also Agnelli kind of helped, saw to it that Mussolini kept Ford out. Ford tried to get a foothold in Italy but failed.
Yes,
they just got shut out. They were going to go into business with Isotta Fraschini. One point, they were going to build a factory in Livorno. Yeah, just didn't happen. And I think basically Agnelli managed to convince Mussolini quite easily that it wasn't a good idea.
That's not the last time that Ford gets blocked from Italy. It happens later on in the 20th, late in the 20th century. Yeah. Our next character that I want to explore is Enzo Ferrari. Born in 1898, he was a soldier during the First War, and His brother and his father both die of Spanish flu. He is released from the army after actually getting sick himself, and then finds himself on the street with a little bit of inheritance money, but needs a job and tries to find work at Fiat, but he really doesn't have any skill. As you say in the book, he could do little more than shoe horses. So they turn him away. First, he becomes essentially a shuttle driver. He's taking truck chassis and driving them to a coach builder to have the bodies fitted, and then becomes a test driver for a small automaker called CMN. And he races a CMN in the 1919 Targa Florio, and that's really where his career kicks off.
Yeah, he gets noticed by people at Alfa Romeo, and gradually becomes part of the racing team, Alfa's racing team. He does quite well as a racer, but quite early on, like lots of people who go on to be great team bosses, they realize, actually, I think I'm better at running things than, and he becomes a very, very good team manager, and then sets up his own racing team. On it goes. It's the challenge writing about him is because everybody's written about him, and there are lots of very, very good books already, which your listeners will probably know and have on their shelves. And for me, it was like, how do I deal with this? But actually absorbing it into my story, because he touches base with everybody else along the way. It was all fine in the end, but I did somewhat diminish him, because he's like a cuckoo in the nest. He would have he would have obliterated everybody else. He's a hard guy to write about because he's just so driven, so ruthless, so dedicated that he doesn't have some of the charm that, say, Lancia has or Pininfarina has. So he's tough to write about.
Yeah, he has a hard exterior shell that's you can't penetrate.
Quite hard interior as well, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Well, one of the most human moments in the book with Ferrari is when Fiat turns him away, and you talk about how he slept on a park bench in the snow and kind of wept.
Yeah.
Just unsure what was going to become of himself.
He goes into Victoria Park, having been turned away from Fiat, and just sweeps the snow off the bench and lies down, cries. And he has the satisfaction of returning to Victoria Park 20 years later, where there's a racetrack in the park, and Ferrari wins one of his first races.
Yeah.
And then he said, I cried again, but for different reasons.
Right. Yeah, it's a marvelous scene. So Enzo is very successful from the time in 1920 when he's brought on at Alfa Romeo, and ends up running their racing team, which is sort of a quasi factory team in a way. Is that fair to say?
Very Italian. It's kind of like where, you're sort of separate, but you're kind of in, and every now and then there'd be a change of management. So management at Alfa Romeo was always changing. So, I don't know. I think we got to bring him in house, because they didn't really. I mean, he wanted to be his own guy. I mean, that Enzo Ferrari just wanted to be left alone to get on with it because he was just better at it than anybody else, and he knew he was. And he was very clear about what he was good at. He never pretended to be an engineer. He never pretended to know better. His great line was, "I'm an agitator of men." Right. I bring people together and I make them compete. It's quite tough working for Ferrari back then because you were kind of competing with these other guys. He said, well, I've got this engineer, but I'm bringing this other guy on as well. And, you guys are going to work together. And so he liked to kind of establish that kind of competition between people. But one thing that is slightly striking about him is that because he wasn't an engineer and he was all about, again, one of the things his cars did right from the start is they worked right from the start. They ran, he didn't want to, he was wary about going to Le Mans. Chinetti convinced him, got to go to Le Mans. I'm going to go to Le Mans, wins the race. The cars were very, very robust and reliable. And one of the reasons I think has something to do with, he was quite conservative from an engineering point of view. And so when in the 30s, Colombo first went to work for him. I think it was Colombo first went to work for him. They were talking about putting the engine behind the driver, like in the Outer Union. And he's, no, I don't want any of that. Don't want any of that. And he was very, very resistant. And of course, famously in the 1950s, when he saw John Cooper's little rear engine for, he said, the ox does not push the cart,
Right.
He was very, very resistant to innovation. And indeed, it was when the Brits, when Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins were these Brits who went to race for Ferrari in the 50s, they said, we on the Jaguar, we've got disc brakes. We should have disc brakes on our Ferraris. He was quite slow on the uptake and resistant. He just thought, I'll just build the most powerful engine. I mean, just picture it. It's 1945. Everything's been bombed. Places in ruins. His own factory has been bombed quite badly. And he sits down and goes, what am I going to do in 1945? The place is in ruins. Everybody's unemployed. Everything is short. Yeah, I'm going to build a V12 engine. Yeah, I'll build a V12. Get a Colombo. Let's do a V12 engine. It's that kind of audacity of just, regardless of how bad things are, I'm going to look beyond that. It's a great Italian quality.
Yes. And Gioacchino Colombo was thinking the same thing. He thought V12 and Ferrari was thinking V12. And so, boom, they build the 125. Yeah. Back to his early days at Alfa, I just want to mention a very pivotal moment for Alfa Romeo was when they needed a new chief engineer, and Ferrari's suggestion was this guy over at Fiat named Vittorio Jano, who was a Hungarian by birth, but his family had emigrated to Italy, and his Hungarian name was Victor Jano, but he Italianized it to Vittorio. And master mechanical engineer, he was persuaded to leave Fiat. They gave him a sweetheart deal to come to Alfa. And he designs these incredible racing engines beginning in the 1920s, designs the 6C and 8C engines, which are legendary. And although they were technically less advanced than the Auto Unions and the Mercedes-Benz racers, the Silver Arrows during the late 1930s, the Alphas held their own, partly because of Jano and his design, but also because of some incredible drivers, most prominently Tazio Nuvolari. And I think we should touch on that just a bit.
Oh, yes. I mean, he's such a wonderful character because he was, to see him driving, there's footage, you can look at it on YouTube. The footage of him driving, his arms are, his elbows are all out of the way. He's like urging, sort of slapping, and people say you would see him slapping the side of the cowl, like you might a horse, just urging this thing on. And there's this, basically, he I mean, I don't know whether this is definitely the case, but folklore has it that he pretty much invented the four-wheel drift, because when Ferrari famously rode as a riding mechanic with him, and was just kind of trying to look out, sees the feet, watches his feet, and sees he goes into a corner, doesn't put his foot on the brake at all, just throws the car into this slide. So by the time it gets to the end of the apex of the corner, it's facing the right way to come out again. And people wouldn't hire him. I mean, Alfa Romeo were resistant to hiring him to start with because they just thought, he's going to crash. This man is going to die very soon with his style. And, of all the drivers, he seemed like by far and away the most crazy driver. He died in his bed, extraordinary. But he was this little wiry guy. He was small. He didn't start motor racing until he was in his late 20s. He'd been cycle racing, and he came to it quite late. But he just had this charming quality. And a lot of them were hellraisers. He was a dedicated family man. He was just impossible not to love. And there was a fantastic moment in the German Grand Prix, I think it's 1935, when Alfa Romeos are basically completely outclassed by the Mercedes and Auto Union. I mean, in fact, what had happened was the Third Reich, Hitler had basically sponsored both teams, both Mercedes and Auto Union, really lavish sponsorship. which Mussolini never gave it to Alfa Romeo. So they never had the funds. But in spite of this, in 1935, Nuvolari went to the Nürburgring and just held in there. And, eventually the Silver Arrows, one by one, fell away, and he won the race. And they didn't even have a recording of the, they didn't have the music for the Italian national anthem to play, because everybody assumed that the Germans would win.
Right. They didn't have a tricolor, and they didn't have the anthem. And I think Nuvolari pulls a record of some other song out of his satchel or something, and they put that over the loudspeakers. That is one of the most compelling scenes in the entire book, I have to say. Like, just you go through how he whittles his way through the field, and one of the auto union drivers is known for really being hard on his tires. And at a certain point, Nuvolari calculates, well, if I go for a tire change right now, I'm going to lose several positions. So I'm just going to stay behind him. And the auto union car blows a tire and it's out. And then now he's number one and he goes to victory. A fantastic scene in the book. I love it. It's so good.
Which also tells you, see, because everyone assumes, because the way Nuvolari looks like he's driving, he looks like he's really killing the car, but he's not.
Right.
It's a kind of theatrical kind of thing. It's just the way he did it, the way he did his thing. Yeah. But he was very good at finishing.
He was also a great self-promoter. He had his costume was sort of this blue and yellow. He had a logo, which was a turtle. And he had his own little monogram, TN, with a turtle on it. His nickname was the Flying Mantuan. You got to have a nickname if you want to be a character, right?
You have, yeah.
So,
and he was when he came to Britain, he was mobbed in London. He was going to buy some shirts in Jermyn Street, and he was mobbed, and he couldn't believe how does anyone know me? Because newsreels had only just started, and already people had seen him, so they recognized him, and he was so charmed by that. He didn't expect that.
Yeah.
Very modest man.
Another character in the book that features prominently in the latter half is Johnny Agnelli. You mentioned him earlier. He was the grandson of Giovanni Agnelli, and his father, Eduardo, was killed in a flying accident in 1935. So there's a gap between the grandfather and the grandson in terms of managing Fiat.
Yeah.
And Fiat is in good hands under Vittorio Valletta, right?
Valletta. This is a really interesting distinction between him and Henry Ford. It's very interesting to look at Agnelli and Henry Ford, because in many ways they have lots of things in common. One thing Agnelli had, he was really, really good at hiring talent. And so when you get to the end of the 30s, the guys that Henry Ford I has around him, I mean, they're just kind of like henchmen. But from very early on, Agnelli hires Valletta's he meets Valletta when they're on the other side, on opposing sides in some dispute with a component. And he likes the way this guy is stubborn and really argues his position. So he hires him. He wants to get the best talent. He wants the best and the brightest. And so, in fact, the company is in very good hands. And Valletta sticks around right through to the 60s. And in fact, Gianni's kind of like, this is great. I can let him do it. And so off he went. I mean, he was there, but, and he was a great figurehead.
Well, and as a matter of fact, Giovanni tells Johnny, after he does his wartime service, the old man says to his grandson, you should take it easy. Don't worry about Fiat.
Yes.
And Johnny, he does it 10x, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, for about 7 years, he is this international playboy, rubbing shoulders in the south of France with all these luminaries and betting women, eventually becoming friends with a young John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
Having an affair with Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, whose marriage is on the ropes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And he becomes an international style icon.
Yes.
And by the 50s and early 60s, he's sort of the standard bearer for the La Dolce Vita and Italian style in general. It's incredible.
Totally, yes. Because I mean, what's so interesting is that I only touch on this really, but the kind of revolutionary Italian style just takes over, in Europe and in America, and that whole story is kind of fascinating. And the movies help, all the great Hollywood movies that are actually made in Cinecittà in the Rome studio. There's just a great. Everybody loves the Italians, and they just love how cool they are. And there's this wonderful word which I picked up on when I was researching the book, sprezzatura. And it's a word that cannot be translated into English. Basically, what it means is the art of doing something really well without appearing to be trying too hard.
Yes.
And I think that so sums up so much of what these guys do.
Yeah, it's fantastic. With regard to Johnny being told by his grandfather to take it easy, it's interesting. You have a quote from Giovanni, the grandfather. He said, "For 40 years, I've been assailed by the demon of work, and I've never done anything else in my life. Now that I've reached the end, I wonder if that wasn't a mistake." And that has to be part of the reason he tells his grandson, take it easy, kind of live your life, enjoy things for a bit.
It's quite poignant, isn't it? Because you see that, Giovanni Senior was a workaholic. He proved himself. He needed to prove himself. He'd grown up, his father had died young. They weren't really properly established in the society. And, he threw himself so totally into his work. And then he outlived both his children. And I think that must have been very hard. Very hard. Eduardo killed, and his daughter died earlier on. I mean, he had fantastic grandchildren, but I think he was Susanna Agnelli, who became a senator in the Italian government after the war. She was Gianni's sister. She describes, there's a wonderful snapshot which I've got in the book of her describing when she was a child, having lunch with the grandparents. And the grandfather, Giovanni, would just sit there on his own with his own salad, didn't really talk, and then just went away and lay down for 10 minutes and then went back to work. And that's really all she saw of him. He was a complete and total workaholic.
Yeah. Peter, how much more time do you have?
As long as you want. It's fine. This is fun. This is fun.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. That's all for part 1 of my interview with Peter Grimsdale on his new book, Superveloce. I'll see you back here for part 2 on Wednesday, December 17th. If you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, don't forget to visit buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and become a patron. And thank you to those of you who've already donated. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.